All right, we have time for questions. Those of you on the web, if you submit them, we will incorporate them into the discussion. Yes, please.
Yes, good morning. This is Natasha Harrigan with the District of Columbia Department of Parks and Recreation. So I wanted to refer specifically to, I believe it was your first recommendation about ineffective programs, and listed in one of the bullets was essentially what we do a lot of, which is midnight basketball, community centers. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you arrived at that decision and how we can maybe change your mindset a little bit about that? I just want to get a more clear understanding of that.
Yeah, specifically midnight basketball was part of the evaluation, the meta-analysis that Mark Lipsey did, which is how I came to include that. But my understanding was that if the effort was to bring together, there are many versions of midnight basketball. If the effort is to bring together those with a criminal record or already known to the justice system, specifically to bring them together with each other to spend time in a community center, that the evaluations suggest that those programs don't lead to more positive outcomes. Perhaps because of the kinds of processes and mechanisms that Tom was describing about opportunities for deviancy training. On the other hand, after-school programs, community center programs that bring together identified aggressor, bully, deviant individuals with a broader range of peers might well be successful, depending on what the peer culture is that's developed there. Is it a culture of deviancy training in which the more aggressive participant persuades the less aggressive participants to get involved in a gang or in deviant behavior or criminal behavior? Or is there a positive peer culture in which the non-aggressive peers have greater influence over the aggressive peers? I think it depends. A simple example of it that I saw with my children when they were 3, 4, 5 years of age in Montessori school classrooms. What they do is brilliant. So what they do, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, imagine the 3-year-olds are the aggressive, deviant, unsocialized participants, and the 5-year-olds know the ropes and know how to be pro-social and know the rules and know how to get along and how not to throw the blocks at each other. So what they do is at the beginning of the school year, they bring together the 5-year-olds first, and then they bring in the 4-year-olds, and then after several days, they bring in the 3-year-olds one at a time, so that there's clearly a peer culture of non-deviance. And the 3-year-olds learn that and don't have an opportunity to be the ones who are teaching the others the path toward deviance. So I'm a big advocate of after-school programs, community programs, but I think we ought to think carefully about the processes that Tom has studied and how to engineer them in a pro-social way.
Sure, and I definitely agree with that last statement. I'd be interested to see that research because I've actually witnessed myself the successes of all of the scenarios you described. So I'd be interested in seeing the research and just sharing.
How do you engineer the success in those programs?
Well, it varies. I mean, it depends from ward to ward, from site to site within each ward. It all depends on who your base is. So once the communities, the recreation specialists who are working in those particular sites know what they're dealing with, they engineer it so that it's unique to that particular situation. So it can vary across this city, so surely it varies across the country. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine? Oh, I'm sorry, Tom, did you want to respond to that?
Catherine Bradshaw, I'm on one of the panels. Yesterday we talked a little bit about some of the bullying prevention literature and specifically the systematic review that Maria Tofty and David Farrington had put together. And they also noted that peer facilitator, peer-led programs were ones associated with negative effects. So there's some findings specifically in the area of bullying as well. And when they looked at that, they included not just grouping peers together, but peer-led programs. And so we spent some time yesterday thinking a little bit about social network analysis, and I know both of you have done a lot of work about influential peers and things, and we have actually a youth board here that's talking, and many of these youth were involved as facilitators and leaders. And one of the challenges we have is trying to find an evidence base for peer-led programs. So kind of moving away from the grouping deviant youth, but having youth play a leadership role. And I really can't find any systematic research on that. I'd really like to hear from you all. One of the challenges we have is sometimes youth that are volunteering for those roles are not particularly influential in their peer group. And so might that actually, sometimes they have a history of victimization themselves and are somewhat marginalized from the group. And so when you think about them leading a program among their peers, they're low in influence. And so some models might work better when they go, for example, being at a high school going down to a middle school, because by age they have a higher status. But when you're thinking within a high school, how do we think about from a social network perspective and peer influence about how we can use youth to change that culture? Because there's a lot of energy around that, but very limited research. So
I'll begin to speak to this. Something I was going to say in response to the last question is I've run groups for years as a child clinical psychologist, and I was involved in running some of the groups where we found negative effects. And I had the experience too that a lot of the kids were benefiting in the groups, and I think the group leaders and myself were quite excited and enthusiastic because we did see gains. And we did actually in our research document gains in terms of improved interaction skills with other kids and with their parents. The problem was that there were side effects, and the side effects were increases in other forms of problem behavior. And those were, and as we went back and looked at what happened, it was a lot of the interactions that I've described happened before the group started, when kids were leaving the group. And so that's why Ken is emphasizing the issues of monitoring and unstructured time. In terms of group leaders, we also brought in kids that had a history that had turned their lives around and used them as group leaders and worked with them extensively in the group, and I thought they were very effective. Some kids were more so than others. There was a tendency for some of the kids, I think for the kids that we were applauding and were helping them move forward, there's always slippages. There's times where they've moved back, they engage in some problem behaviors, but they're still getting pretty good grades, and so I think that there's a danger there as well, and you just can't emphasize enough structuring up those environments so that you really have a handle on. For example, one of the kids that was one of our best group leaders was also selling marijuana, and he turned his grades from F's to B's and A's. He was on the football team. He had stopped being aggressive, but he was still engaged in some problem behavior. So it's just complicated in that respect.
Yeah. I'd like to add to it by responding to one part of Catherine's good question about peer leaders, both in classrooms and natural settings as well as in intervention groups. So there is an empirical developmental phenomenon that aggressive bullies are by and large disliked by the larger peer group in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, but often by the time of middle school, there's a different kind of culture that has emerged, and the aggressive child is seen as liked and more popular, and there's actually a positive correlation between aggressing and being popular and liked in at least some contexts and sites in middle school. And if that's kind of the way it is, one might think about how to get those deviant peer group leaders who have influence to use their influence in a positive way rather than a negative way. So I'm reminded of an intervention that my colleague Phil Costanzo developed in the 1990s. Now, he hasn't pursued it to wide-scale dissemination, but there's a kernel of a terrific idea here, which is that how do you identify the deviant peer group leaders in 8th grade and get them to adopt the non-deviant message to use their leadership skills and their persuasiveness over peers, but in a positive way. So Phil, as a social psychologist, had a model of moving from extrinsic motivators of those peer leaders onto intrinsic motivators. So he tried to identify what would be an extrinsic motivator for a deviant, aggressive 7th or 8th grader. This was in Durham, North Carolina in 1993, and so his answer was time with Duke basketball players. Grant Hill was a participant in this study, and he offered his time with deviant peer group leaders. And in that context, he could speak a no-drug message, a no-bullying, a non-aggression kind of message, and teach that, and try to get those kids to adopt that, and then they, in turn, would then go back to their classrooms and try to communicate that kind of message. So there were some pilot studies by Phil that seemed very promising, and I think it's an idea that potentially is worth still exploring.
Yes, please.
Good morning. It's kind of tall here. Good morning. My name is Shannon Campbell. I'm from DC Parks and Recreation. I have a kind of like a 3-part question. The first question is something I hit about monitoring hotspots. Now, a lot of times, a lot of our agency, the recreation centers are located in hotspots, as per se. Now, we as an agency have a good partnership with the Metropolitan Police Department, fire, EMS, things of that nature. We also operate at pretty obscure hours, like say we close at like 9 o'clock. Now, what happens after the rec center is closed, everybody goes home, things of that nature? I mean, obviously, if you're not from DC, also that, the police department also have a lot of issues with trying to just maintain the level of crime down. It's not like you can just stop them from being out there. So it's like, what other practices would you have suggested in order to put in place in order to kind of keep the area safe? That's part one. Part two.
So maybe, given the long line of people, can I ask them to respond to part one,
Sure.
and then time permitting, we'll come back to part 2 and 3?
All right, go ahead.
Great, thank you.
So one thing that students of ecology have learned are that aggressive deviant behavior doesn't occur indiscriminately in all locations or at all times of day. In schools, the bathroom is notorious as a place for bullying to occur, right? Or one can have the stereotype of the, unmonitored dark back alley, whatever it might be. I know less about neighborhood kinds of interventions, but those hot spots, might be where police or community leaders, with better lighting, with better, more adults there, those kinds of interventions just make a whole lot of sense as a way of preventing that kind of deviant peer group aggregation and then the deviancy training to occur.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have you in the queue. I've memorized the order, so
No problem.
time permitting, we'll bring you back. Yes, next.
Hi, Tracy Vinecourt, University of Ottawa. If you had a choice, so you have a very deviant child, let's say a 14-year-old boy, and you can put him in a group intervention with other like-minded individuals, or no intervention, what would your choice be?
If it were my kid, that's the way I like to think
would never
about
have
it,
a
as if it
DV.
was my 14-year-old. I would prefer no intervention and deal with it myself. Yeah.
But if it wasn't your child, so I'm just asking, is it better to not intervene versus putting them in these group interventions where you see deviancy training occurring?
Good question. I mean, not all group interventions are equivalent, and I think Ken did a wonderful job kind of laying that out. But the ones that are typically occurring out in the community, the resources are low, therapists aren't paid well, et cetera, I'd say a lot of those could potentially be iatrogenic, and I would suggest no intervention rather than have my kid placed in that. So I just couldn't recommend anything else for anybody else's.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Shaw. I'm one of the youth panelists. Dr. Dodge, I know you were mentioning sort of the questionable nature of some of the peer groups and also specifically peer influence. And I just wanted to bring up the work of Elizabeth Pollack, who's a Princeton professor who's working right now with employing the influential students within social networks in middle schools, particularly 60 New Jersey middle schools. And what she's been finding is that if you can actually use the social networks and target the influential students within the community and put them through specific programs that are moderated by adults, it actually, those perceptions and that normative behavior has been shown to permeate through the whole school, which I found really interesting. But sort of along that line, I was sort of wondering, when you guys talk about sort of changing normative behavior, how do you propose that we sort of start that, and how do we plant those seeds?
A couple of quick answers. So that intervention, first intervention you described, sounds very intriguing. I'd like to learn more about it. It sounds similar to what I understand Phil Costanza was doing in using social network analysis and sociometric responses to identify deviant leaders and then to train them and then to have them use their natural leadership skills. So I'd like to learn more about that. The second part of your question was about
Sort of germinating those seeds of change.
So starting younger, creating positive peer cultures, engineering them, being intentional about engineering positive peer cultures rather than waiting for them to develop and then to try to rehabilitate or change an already deviant culture is very difficult. So I would think carefully about the first day of middle school and how you bring kids together and how you engineer a positive peer culture. With the example I gave of 3, 4, 5-year-olds in a Montessori school setting, ramp it up to how would you engineer a middle school or a high school. In fact, the very way that we put together middle schools is interesting. So my colleagues, Clara Mushkin, Sunny Ladd, Phil Cook have done a study of whether 6th graders should be with elementary school kids or with 7th and 8th graders. It happens across the state of North Carolina. There's wide variation in that practice, just by happenstance. It's probably random. 6th graders who happen to go to an elementary school have less drug use, fewer school suspensions, less deviant behavior, higher academic test scores than 6th graders who are spending their time with 7th and 8th graders who are more deviant. And those effects hold not only while they're in 6th grade, but they follow these kids into high school. So now they're in 9th grade, they're all in the same schools. Those who had spent 6th grade with 7th and 8th graders have more drug use suspensions. So I think there's something about the way we engineer schools that we might rethink. I think there's also something about that early adolescent period, 6th grade, 7th grade, that's very crucial. That's when kids are most susceptible to peers become more important. They're more susceptible to peer influences. They look to older kids. As I said before, sociometrically, the deviant peer becomes more popular. So I think we can do a lot more in the way of engineering of social contexts.
But if you're saying in middle
just add to that real quickly. So I'm agreeing with Ken, and we just found that when we randomize kids by the individual level in 6th grade to their 7th grade classroom for other purposes, we had 3 schools we did that. 2 of the schools were not able to maintain the randomization. One school was. The school that maintained the randomization, that means the kids were assigned randomly to their homeroom in 7th grade, were less likely to pick other kids who had drug use as friends. So there was in the peer influence literature, there's selection and influence. Those are 2 different. Well, we were able to change selection by randomization of kids to classes. Well, I thought, kind of following up on Ken's idea, if we were to think more mindfully about how we place kids in schools and think about the engineering of social context so that we're mixing kids up and giving those norm-type messages. Now, I think what happened is we had our classroom-wide curriculum, and that changed the norms, and the norms created different preferences for friends.
Thank you so much.
Is there a question on the side?
Yeah. My name is Susan Kahn. I'm from the Conflict Resolution Center of Montgomery County. And when I was seeing a list of alternatives to peer-focused interventions, and I continue to be surprised that I'm not seeing more about conflict resolution and mediation in the schools. I think there needs to be more research about that and an awareness of that as a potential anti-bullying intervention. And just as an example, in Dorchester County in Maryland, the Community Mediation Center has been in the schools for 2 years and is finding they're having a tremendous impact on reducing suspensions. And their approach involves not just mediating cases, but also restorative dialogues, a peace club, training kids who are in detention in conflict resolution skills. And there are just certain parts of the toolkit that you can use with conflict resolution that could even, relate to Parks and Rec when they're asking what can happen after 9 o'clock. Well, what if online there was an online rap group with people trained in conflict resolution stuff, or whatever available, or a social group, et cetera, for those, specifically for that community. That could be, another alternative. But anyway, I'm just wondering your thoughts on the conflict resolution and such. Let me just add one last thing. When you talked about peer focus groups, a lot of the conflict resolution that we do can involve up to 5, 6, 7 students at a time. And we find that instead of one student saying, oh yeah, I really should have apologized for that, it never should have escalated, I want to get the 3 or 4 other people in here too before I make that apology, because I think we should all do it together. And so we're finding that they have a tremendous influence in this very adult supervised, kind of peer-oriented communication setting in the schools.
I think it's potentially very promising. I haven't reviewed the literature systematically, don't know as much about it, but it makes a lot of sense, and what you say makes a lot of sense as well. It seems very promising.
So I want to follow up the previous question. My name is Jana Juvonen, and yesterday I talked about the benefits of ethnic diversity, and that we can think about diversity in so many different ways. And here, the whole idea of creating groups that are very diverse or non-homogeneous behavior-wise is an intriguing one. So when you think about the ideal groups, randomization is a wonderful way to go about doing them, but if you were to systematically create groups to prevent problem behaviors, what do you think is more important? Is there like a critical mass, or should we be more concerned about not the numbers, but about status of particular peers, and how certain behaviors correlate with the high status?
Yeah, terrific question. So if peer influence is a dramatic phenomenon, one might ask whether adverse peer influences are equally offset by positive peer influences, and is there any kind of net effect? Another way to frame it is, imagine you're the superintendent of a school system, 20% of your children are deviant. Where do you place them? Are you going to have a net overall positive effect, perhaps by sending them off to an alternative school or tracking them, even though it might have a negative effect on them? Is it going to have a positive effect on the other 80% who don't have to deal with them? After all, these placements are directed by parents of the non-deviant kids who don't want deviant kids with their well-behaving child, right? So I'm involved in a study with a student, Lucy Sorensen, who's analyzed the 2 million children who are placed in public schools in North Carolina. We've got data on every one of them. And she finds that there are nonlinear relations, and there are ways to create net positive effects by attending to this critical mass idea, that if you have no more in elementary and early middle school, no more than 3 children who are in the previous year suspended, right, in a classroom in the subsequent year, they seem to have minimal deviant influence on the rest of the new peer group, right? But if you raise the level over a critical mass, it's not quite clear what that is, then the deviant peer influence seems to outweigh the positive peer influence. So there may be ways, the work's not done yet, but there may be ways to engineer the whole system, right, to maximize the positive influence and minimize the the deviant peer influence. I think following from some of the kinds of work you've done.
Yeah, I might add, so you know, we have these sociometrics that researchers use, but they could also be used to design or engineer environments in that to take kids that are, you know, some of our kids that we're worried about are rejected but liked, and the popular kids, et cetera. So we've used them, sociometrics, to create groups, and that we would identify mixes of kids that were more likely to get along with a critical racial idea in mind. And so we would use positive nominations as a guide to forming groups. So we'd maximize the likelihood that we would, it would be a positive experience for both the higher risk and the low risk kids. I think some practices we do right now are the opposite with academic tracking and that kind of thing. We're actually funneling them off into classrooms that have the opposite type of effect. But I think there's data-based approaches, so, you know, that you've talked about. So I think that's something for the future, and we should be studying that. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm delighted we've had so many questions. What I'm going to do is take these last two questions together in the interest of time.
All right, Shannon Campbell again, DC Parks and Rec. You were talking about, in one of the slides, talking about separating the younger youth from older deviant peers. Now, my question is, sometimes where I work, or in the ages, in the places I've worked, the older peers are the relatives of the younger peers, okay? You have so many brothers and sisters and cousins that are living under the same household. They also attend the same schools, all of that stuff at the same time. Now, how would you go about separating that? If you're trying to modify the behavior of a younger child, okay, but you're still influenced by the older one, how do you separate that? It's like, because you can separate them all at once. You can separate them at so many parts of the time, but then they go back to the deviant behavior, of the older siblings, and they'll have that influence over them no matter what you try to feed into them. How do you go about separating that dynamic and making sure that you keeping the positive behaviors into that younger youth so they can make a change? Because after a while, there's certain things that you just cannot change about an older person. They're just going to be how they are.
Thank you. And
So
we're just going to take them together.
Oh, together? Okay.
Since we're down to yellow light.
Okay. My name is Suzanne Lemenestrel. I'm with the 4-H National Headquarters at the United States Department of Agriculture. And my question, we use, obviously a peer leader model. And I was also curious about the research on the effectiveness of mentoring, both with youth as mentors as well as adults as mentors, and its impact on bullying.
Can I layer in one last thought? And that is, we focused this thus far on peer interventions focused on deviant behavior. And I wonder if you could also just say a word or two about peer interventions that seeks to build resilience among potential victims of bullying. So with those three questions, we have
I
Pick and choose as you
guess
see
I want to
fit.
respond to the first question. I think those of you who are working in communities where it's more complicated than what these types of this type of research seems to address, it's extremely important for us to be able to understand how to approach and be useful. And when you talk about older siblings and younger siblings, of course, I'm reminded of the kids that we've been working with, and the piece that's missing here is the family-centered piece. So mobilizing the parents in a way that puts them in a leadership role around who's involved and who's not involved, I think is part of the solution. Not so, I think when we're talking about classrooms and structuring up other types of contexts, everything we talk about makes sense in terms of keeping younger kids out of the context of older kids who might affect them. But in general, we just need to get the adults, primarily the parents and or teachers, to have a leadership role on what those kids are doing in their activities.
Real quickly about the other two questions. So 4-H and that kind of developing peer leaders makes a whole lot of sense to me, and the evidence is positive. Evidence about mentor programs. I think we heard earlier this morning about Big Brother, Big Sister kinds of programs. It's generally positive. With regard to the question about groups for victims, I'd say a couple of things. One is a lot of the victims are aggressors as well, that there's actually a positive correlation between being victimized and bullying. So identifying a group of victim-only children is a bit more rare. And I'd be frankly probably worried about it. I don't know the evidence. I don't know if there is evidence, but I'd be worried by some of the same processes of developing victim identities and then what that might lead to in maybe not aggression, but in kinds of depression or anxiety. I might worry about that as well, but I don't know the evidence about it.
Okay. I'm thrilled that there's been such great interest. We are out of time, so please join me in thanking our two presenters. We have a short break now. We'll reconvene at 11.